O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fill us all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O God. Okay, so tonight we're going to continue on church history. Does anybody have any questions from last week? Do you have the Bibles or your book study?
Sure.
Okay.
You want me to?
Okay, but literally 15 minutes. No more.
Literally 15 minutes. I think I can get this in under 15 minutes.
Okay.
I mean, no matter what I do for this book, it's going to be pretty truncated because there's a lot of ground covered here. I've been reading pretty quickly, try and be prepared for this, Man in the Cosmos by Lars Thunberg. And I guess if you're looking to apprehend or just get into like deep end theology, you could do a lot worse in this book. It's pretty complex, but this is actually like the simplified version. The other version is like ridiculously hard to understand, I guess. And it was written by the same guy. Anyway,
this is the popular version.
This is the popular version, the condensed version, I guess. Yeah,
made for seminary graduates.
No. Yeah, I love this book. It's one of my favorite books, just right off the top. A quick biography of Saint Maximus the Confessor, which is what it's about. Saint Maximus the Confessor, his theology. He was a 7th century theologian. He I forget where he actually was from. Where was he?
I think he was from Palestine.
Palestine. Yeah. He was somebody who battled the heresy of the monothelistists. Is that the right pronunciation? And at the time, the principalities were on the side of that heresy, so he was asked to come and present his case in Constantinople, and they weren't too pleased with what he had to say, so he had his tongue cut out and his right hand cut off, as did like 30 or 40 of his followers. And then like 18 years later, thereabouts, of course he was vindicated after he had died, because he was sent away, and then I'm assuming he died soon after. It must have been because of the infection from having his hand cut off and his tongue cut out. I'm sure that had something to do with it, because he died like a year later or within a year. And then 18 years later, he was vindicated because, of course, the monothelistists lost out. They believed that Christ had one nature, and it was one. He was instead of the dual nature of him being both wholly human and wholly God. They believed that it was one mingled entity. Is that?
It's more. We'll go into that later.
Okay. But anyway, that was his fight, and eventually he won, and of course he was killed and martyred for it. So whatever. That's like the short version of his life. One of the great theologians of all time, kind of underrated, really. Not mentioned a lot of times with like the likes of Augustine and people like that. But anyway, so Thunberg's analysis of Saint Maximus really is centered on reciprocity, which is like God acts upon humanity in history. Humanity reacts to God's acting upon them, and then God reacts to that, and so on and so forth. And that's really how he approaches most of his ideas theologically and everything like that. I got a few of the passages that are really kind of narrowed, like put into plain words how he felt, or not plain words, but really kind of epitomize his feeling. Let's see. God makes himself human for the sake of man through his philanthropy, in the same measure as man, fortified by charity, divinizes himself for God. Man is enraptured by God in the mind to the unknowable, so far as man has manifested through virtues the God by nature invisible. Here we find demonstrated that reciprocity between God and man, which remains the basis of all Maximian theology, all Maximus theology. And then there's another passage. I am more inclined to believe that it is the Maximian idea of a deophysite reciprocity between God and man that is the key to his soteriology. And so that's really where he starts kind of, that's like his starting point for everything that he speaks on, and his whole legacy as a theologian was reciprocity. Thunberg is very, very emphatic about that throughout the book. Maximus was a deeply apophatic theologian. That is, apophatic meaning negative theology, like what we talked about, I guess, like a few weeks ago, where you can only talk about God in terms of what he is not instead of what he is. So Maximus definitely believed in the idea that the human mind can't really apprehend God. It can't really in his entirety or even come close to doing that, and all you can really do is talk about things in a negative sense. And even within that, though, he was very thorough with what he could understand about God from a what he wasn't kind of sense. Let's see if I can find an example. What God is in himself, we never know, but what he reveals of himself never contradicts his proper being and life. What God is in himself, we never know, but what he reveals of himself never contradicts his proper being and life. So it's a really interesting way he puts it there, I think. And then there's also 129. Man on his spiritual journey may thus, according to Maximus, acquire access to a deeper communication with God as being both the creator of all that is and the hidden lord of the insights of the mind, when it embarks upon an ecstatic journey beyond itself. I don't know, I just think that's awesome the way you put that. When the mind, it's through God that our mind can actually transcend its own boundaries, and can only do that when we're in capitulation to God. And this is has to do with his other big idea, revisited idea, which is theandric theology. Theandric meaning, like when, see if I got this right, God and man sort of, or the synthesis between human and deity, or deification, is kind of like what theandric theology kind of has to do with, and talks about it here. Let's see. This is a mystery also beyond any habitus in man. Maximus is not preoccupied with the habitual perfection, but rather with the mystery of reciprocity as such. The reciprocity leaves us with a kind of empty space or void between the uncreated and created order, the latter represented in man. In that space, man moves intentionally, and in that movement he is divinized without any way recognizing what he experiences of communion with God. There, man himself is empty. He lacks the protection of his natural capacities. There remains for him only the mystery of non-comprehension, where, however, he is rewarded by God in divinization. So that's another big theme, is God's altruism, God's charity, that all of this happens because of God's charity through Christ, through his through reciprocity, through him acting as in charity towards mankind through Christ, especially, though I guess through the prophets as well, but specifically and most dramatically through Christ and stuff like that. So what else did he go over here? Divine altruism. One of the more interesting aspects of this book is the part where he talks about the church as a figure of God, or as like as having almost like the kind of makeup of God, like even in his physical form, like in a corporeal sense. 1:15. Goes over it. I just use the actual words because he says it so much better than I ever could. This is actually Maximus's words here. The Holy Church is thus, as stated, an icon of God, in that it accomplishes the same unity among the believers as God. However, different they are by their characteristics and in their different places and ways of life, they find themselves nevertheless unified in it through faith. This unity was accomplished by God in regard to the essences of beings without confusion, in bringing into silence and sameness what there is of difference. I really like that. As has been demonstrated through their tendency toward him in their unification with him as cause and ground and goal. And he sees like the way the church is constructed, the actual like architecture of the church as a sort of everything is being symbolic of God in a physical and spiritual sense, and those two things kind of are synthesized, and it's really interesting the way he thought of that as being, one kind of organic. I don't know what the word would be, but it's really interesting part of his theology on that. And then so those are like the big ideas that are covered in this book. No matter what I say, it's going to be really, really truncated, of course. But it's if you're looking to really kind of get into this kind of theology and kind of appropriate it, or try to appropriate it for yourself and apply it to your own life or whatever, I mean, you could do a lot worse than this book. Just really, really fascinating stuff. I'm probably going to reread it because I just read it in like a week and a half, so I wasn't able to, ruminate on it as much as I wanted to, because I wanted to give an analysis of it here. But anyway, yeah, Man in the Cosmos, awesome book. Is there any? Oh, there's one more page I wanted. That was like the best thing that he wrote in the entire book, or like my favorite passage from it. I know I'm probably running short on time. Finally, through this mediation in Christ, man should penetrate through a process of circumcision, pericrosis, analogous to that which takes place between the natures in Christ, entirely into God. So he should penetrate. Forget what I did. Finally, through this mediation in Christ, man should penetrate entirely into God and become all that God might be, without, however, any ontological assimilation. Or in other words, our egos are not replaced by God, but rather transformed by God. So I guess that's what you're talking about the other day when you're saying our personalities, our uniqueness remains, but it's transformed, it's transcended.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that. And what was the other one? It's such a good one. One quote in this is just like so beautiful. Man is a mystical church through his body as... Oh, this is where this is where he talks. This is where he talks about like the church itself as kind of like a symbol and but an actual physical manifestation at the same time of God. Man is a mystical church. Through his body and his nave, he illuminates the practical life of his soul through the energies of the commandments. In accordance with moral philosophy, through the sanctuary of his soul, he brings to God, through natural contemplation and reason, the sensible logoi, as purely detached in the spirit from matter. And through the altar of his spirit, so he's talking about the church in terms of the altar, the nave, the different like actual, you know, in a spiritual sense. And through the altar of his spirit, he invokes the silence full of hymns of praise, the silence of the invisible and unknown great voice of divinity. So that's a big part of like one of the more interesting parts of his theology is just that he is talking about how the church itself is a physical kind of representation of God in a physical sense, and then in a spiritual sense, and that those two things are kind of combined and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, it's just a really cool book. Bethany's the one who checked it out, and I probably wouldn't have even checked it out if she hadn't or whatever, but I'm glad she did. That was pretty awesome. And anything else? He talks about salvation. There's a whole section on sin. His idea of the Eucharist is like very complicated to the point where like Thunberg is just almost incapable. He can't even like encompass it. It's just so complex that he, and it's almost as though he concludes that it's almost like Maximus is not taking a real stand on the issue of the Eucharist as being purely non-symbolic or purely actual or anything like that. It's pretty. That's the only part of the book I actually didn't like. So an entire chapter about how basically Maximus didn't really have a direct kind of theology on the Eucharist. It took him like 15 pages for me to finally be like, oh, so you don't know what he actually meant.
Actually, he does have a very solid theology on the Eucharist, but Thunberg is a Lutheran.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Kind of reading his own stuff.
But he was talking about a lot of the other scholars who came to the same one came to one conclusion. The other said that Maximus was like actually in favor of looking at it as a symbolic thing, and another guy said that and all these different scholars. So I feel like he wasn't just coming from his own perspective. He was trying to. But yeah, that was the only part that's kind of like leaves you blank.
I did a master's thesis on that.
Oh really? Yeah. on what, the Eucharist is?
In Maximus, yeah.
Oh really?
Oh.
Yeah.
And so you think you would say that he does have a
yeah, he does. It's the meaning of the words around symbol, type, and icon changed.
Oh,
that's what changed. And so at the time Maximus was using them, symbol means real. It means it participates in the reality.
Okay.
And so to say it's a symbol or an image doesn't in any way, shape, or form mean that it's not real.
Oh.
Because the word symbol means to throw together. Sim, together. Voli, to throw. So it's a reality that's thrown together. In other words, two realities. One manifests the other. So that the earthly reality manifests and makes present the heavenly reality. And so by partaking of the earthly, you partake of the heavenly.
Right. Okay.
So, but it's not some kind of Protestant. It's not some kind of a nominalist idea that, which is where symbol lost its meaning as conveying reality. In the nominalist movement of the 13th century, 12th and 13th century.
You're saying until the 12th?
Until the 12th, 13th century, the word symbol had the old meaning. After nominalism, which was a movement in very early scholasticism, that's when the word symbol came to mean something detached from the actual reality of that which it symbolized. In other words, the contemporary sense. In the old sense, the symbol conveys the reality of the other. In the modern sense, the symbol simply reminds us of the other thing.
Well, thank you, Vladika. Now the book is truly completed. Do you like the book other than that? I mean,
oh yeah, no. Maximus is one of my favorite theologians.
No, I mean, and
Thunberg is he's very good. He's very good. There's been a whole lot of work done since I did that thesis in 1985.
Oh.
So, but it's and a lot of books and a lot of translations of Maximus have come out. But he's one of the most complex theologians.
Yeah, I gathered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his Greek is a nightmare. Yeah. So. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Very good.
Oh, thanks.
Very interesting.
I hope it wasn't too dense. It was dense for me, so.
You can be buried in Maximus for decades.
I think I might be.
Actually.
What was his background?
He was one of the last great theologians of the Byzantine Empire that was completely fluent both in Latin and Greek. So he lived at the end of the 6th and beginning of the 7th century. He was in Palestine when the Muslims came through, and so he and many others fled to the west. And when he was standing against the emperor, the patriarch, and the pope, against monothelitism, and I'll get into what monothelitism is. It was a very he basically was alone in maintaining the full integrity of Orthodoxy. And yet it was he who was vindicated, and the Pope, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Emperor were condemned.
Wow.
So it's one of the few instances of a Roman Pope being condemned by an ecumenical council as a heretic.
And that was the 6th or 7th ecumenical council?
It was the 5th.
5th. 680, 680.
680.
680, 681.
681, yeah.
So when?
No, it was the 6th.
6th.
Yeah.
When
That was when 18 years after Maximus had died,
Okay.
and then he was vindicated by that council. Yeah.
So.
Pretty interesting story.
Yeah. So anyway, last week, thank you, by the way, Paul. Last week we kind of talked about what was the church like before the first Council of Nicaea. In other words, the first 300 years. Now we get to the 4th century, which is one of the most pivotal and kind of great flowerings of Christian creativity in the entire history of the church. The 4th century saw some radical changes, socially, politically, and especially religiously, with the end of the pagan period of Rome and the beginning of the new Christian period. There are several things that were really that are important to remember so far as kind of socio-political background. In the year 311, Constantine, who had been born around 290, I believe, in Colchester, in England, of his mother Helena, became the emperor of the West. The empire was divided at the time, and he gave what was called the Edict of Milan in the year 311, ending the persecution of Christians. Up until that, and actually fairly recently, before that, there had been one of the most brutal persecutions of the church that the Romans ever let loose, where thousands and thousands and thousands of Christians were martyred by the government. Constantinople eventually became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, and he decided to establish a new capital. He did not convert to Christianity until his deathbed, but he was completely convinced about Christianity long before that. And he wanted to establish a new capital that had absolutely no pagan history to it. So he chose the little town of Byzantium on the Bosphorus, which is this narrow strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, through which all of the trade from all of Asia had to pass in order to get into the Roman Empire. And there was vast amounts of trade. All the silk, all the spices, all the goods from the east and from the Baltic Sea, because they came down the river system through the Dnieper, past where Kiev would stand, and into the Black Sea, and then out. And so Constantinople literally controlled the trade route from all of Asia and Northern Europe into the Roman Empire. It was also a better climate than Rome, and it was also not the goal of the barbarian hordes which were beginning to gather and to already begin raiding throughout the Italian peninsula and move into the west. Europe was settled. It's kind of interesting. There are kind of early Europeans who nobody knows quite what language they spoke, but it wasn't Indo-European. Later on, several Indo-European peoples invaded and took over. The first of these were the Celts, and the Celts were all over the place. They came from Central Asia. Remember St. Paul's letter to the Galatians? Well, the Galatians were Celts living in the middle of what's now Turkey. There was also a big Celtic settlement in current Romania, and then of course the Celts were a major factor throughout Spain, France, and Britain, Scotland and Ireland. Behind the Celts, and then I think the Celtic migration was probably something around 700 BC. Around 300 AD, a little earlier actually, the Germanic tribes started pushing in. The Romans, for example, had been some kind of synthesis between the earlier Europeans and the Celts, I think. I'm not sure exactly where they came. But then the Germanic tribes started pushing in from Central Asia, and eventually took over what we now know to be France and Germany, and with lots of forays down the Italian peninsula, the Goths, the Visigoths, and various and sundry people like that, all the way down, going into North Africa, into Spain, and creating havoc. This began around the year 300, affecting the Western Roman Empire, and culminated in 476 when Rome finally fell to the Germanic tribes. And even when Rome finally fell, the old Rome, basically the Germanic tribes tried to simply take over the Roman structures of government and stuff, but it was fairly unsuccessful. One of the things that had happened was that by the 2nd century AD, Rome was this massive city that was largely fed by the crops brought over from North Africa. So Carthage and Alexandria were these immense ports that sent huge amounts of grain, olive oil, cotton, linen, all these products into Rome to keep this massive city going. When the barbarian invasions happened, the trade routes were disrupted, and so Rome starved. And what had begun when with these first initial raids happened in earnest as the wealthier Roman householders went out into the country, into their country villas with all of their people, with all their extended families, with all their slaves, and established castles, protected little centers which would be hard to raid, and so Rome eventually, gradually fell into ruins. There was still a small village there, but by the 6th century, Rome was basically 10 or 15,000 people living in the ruins, among the ruins, and that was the largest city in the West by that time. In a period of 200 years, it went from a city of 1 million people down to 10 or 15,000. Kind of like Detroit, if you can imagine. In the meantime, Constantinople was developing on the Bosporus, and it prospered. The focal point of the Roman Empire had always been the Eastern Mediterranean. Rome was in the West, obviously, and it did have all of these. It did control the whole Italian peninsula up through Bavaria, into Germany, most of France, and the lower half of Britain. Scotland remained free of Roman domination. They could never quite tame it. And Ireland also never really fell to Roman domination. And where the Romans had gone in and set up Roman administration and all of these kinds of fortified cities as well as villas, where the wealthy landowners would control hundreds of slaves who would work the land and then send the produce back to Rome. They could never conquer these Celtic tribes, the Britons, the Scots, the Irish, and so that never that never took hold in those far western lands, and the Celts were kind of pushed to these and also into Brittany, to these edges. Following the Romans, who didn't do so much pushing other than to civilize, you had the Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Franks also were a Germanic tribe, and the Franks spoke German. That's important to remember. and the Angles and the Saxons also spoke German. And first the Angles, then the Saxons set over plans to take over Roman Britain. And so the Romans abandoned Britain, and then gradually they abandoned all of these far-flung frontiers to the so-called barbarians, my people, and basically Europe descended into what in the West is called the Dark Ages. In the meantime, Constantinople was thriving, and it continued to grow and to prosper, and up until really the middle of the 7th century. And with the middle of the 7th century, there were various theological controversies, we'll get into that, there were various ecumenical councils and things. But one of the most potent things that happened was the rise of Islam. Within 20 years, Islam swept from the middle of Saudi Arabia, which was outside the Roman Empire, all the way, taking the entire North African coast and beyond, and going up all the way into Spain by 637. So within 20 years, half of the Roman Empire was swept away into Islam. And going up probably just past Antioch, so that all what you had left of the Roman Empire was what we call Turkey, and the North Shore of the Black Sea, and the Balkans, and Italy. By that time, Rome itself became a vassal state of Constantinople, and the papacy became a vassal of the Byzantine emperor.
It's a vassal.
A subordinate who would pay money, who would pay tribute to the emperor for protection. It was a protection racket, basically. Now, there had been one, between the collapse of the empire in the West, finally in 450, and the Islamic seizure of the southern half of the empire, there was one really bright spot, and that was Justinian. And Justinian became emperor, I think, around 520, 530. And he took it upon himself to take back as much of the old empire as he could. So he went and he conquered back much of Italy. He took back a lot of France. He never quite got up to Britain or into Bavaria, but he consolidated a lot of the old empire in Northern Europe, or in Europe itself. Africa, still eastern part of Africa remained part of the Byzantine Empire. I don't remember if he retook Carthage or not, but there was this kind of brief restoration of the Roman Empire in the West, which eventually fell apart also. And then with Islam, everything, it was so socio-politically and economically disrupted that there was no trade. The languages were Western languages were forgotten in the East. There were a few bright spots, like Isidore of Seville, who was also, with Maximus as one of the great scholars, who spoke both Greek and Latin. But for the most part, during the Dark Ages, people only spoke one language. Very, very few people could read. But what was interesting is that the church followed the pattern of the nobility, and so from the 4th century on, the church had established monasteries. Well, the monasteries became fortresses eventually, but within them, it was the monasteries that preserved learning. They preserved the libraries, they preserved the books, they preserved the ancient texts and the ancient knowledge, and copied it and distributed it. And it was like the last vestige of Roman civilization.
How far was Christianity spread at that time? During the time of the fall of Rome, and then up until the time that you're talking about?
Well, when Theodosius in the year 381 declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire, about 10% of the Roman Empire, the people were Christians.
Okay. Were there any Celts that were Christians at that time?
Oh yeah,
Oh.
yeah. The missionaries went north and west fairly early, actually. That's about the same time as St. Patrick.
Oh, okay.
And there were Celts in Gaul, and there were Celts in Spain, and so it wasn't unknown.
So it's Christians fighting Christians?
Well, not initially, no. What happened later is that with the Germanic invasions, the Germanic tribes had been evangelized by Arians. Now, Arianism was a huge controversy in the 4th century, begun by a guy named Arius, who was a priest in Alexandria, and his idea was that God was a solitary unity who could admit of no plurality. In other words, as the contemporary Arians say, there is no God but God, and He cannot have a son. Okay, that's what Muslims say every day. And Islam is a form of Arianism.
Does Islam say that it was the Aryans who were actually correct?
No, no.
Okay.
They don't say that. They would say that if they were, and I'm sure there's scholars do who have studied it.
Okay.
But they would say that Arianism was the true Christianity. So very early on, and Arius appeared around the year 300 in Alexandria, teaching the stevedores and the longshoremen on the docks of Alexandria these little ditties, these little songs about these little theological songs, which were then conveyed by these longshoremen and sailors all over the Mediterranean world, because Alexandria was one of the major ports where goods were shipped out all over the Mediterranean. And so his main slogan was, there was a time when the Logos was not. There was a time when the Son did not exist. And his main point was that the Logos, the Word or the Son of God, was a created being, and not divine, and not co-eternal, and not consubstantial with the Father. This became a very popular heresy because the Church hadn't really considered those issues formally, and it took root very much throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the first Council of Nicaea and second Council, First Council of Constantinople, were both called to fight against Arianism. That's where Athanasius began his rise at the First Council of Nicaea. That's where St. Nicholas went up and slapped up Arius, in front of the whole council, and got defrocked for it, until Christ and the Mother of God appeared to all the bishops, handing St. Nicholas back the Gospel and the Homophorium, which were the signs of the episcopacy.
It's hard to believe that the bishops would fight like that.
No, it's not.
But,
Can't fight it. But there were all sorts of interesting confrontations throughout church history.
I'm sure.
I wanted to paint the kind of political context. So on one hand, you've got the old Rome is falling apart. The new Rome is growing and prospering up through, say, let's cut it off around 700 or 650. You've got the
When you say New Rome, are you talking about Constantinople?
Constantinople. Because the whole idea was Constantinople would be the new Rome, but without any pagan background.
Okay.
You go to old Rome and it's, there's the pagan temples and it kind of dominates everything. Constantinople was designed specifically and built so that there were no pagan influences whatsoever.
Okay.
And it really was the dream of a Christian society being incarnated, which Constantine began and saw consecrated. I think the city was consecrated around 332, and I think he died around 335. But it wasn't until his successor Theodosius, 50 years later, that Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire. You also had this other dynamic of the barbarian invasions coming down into the West. And one of the things that happened in the Byzantine Empire, much to their chagrin, is that when they had heretics who were not only violating the canons of the church, but who were on the losing side when a council decided what was orthodoxy and what was heresy, they had to face the civil authorities, and they were banished. Now, there are two major places where heretics were banished. One was to the north, into the forests of northern Europe, which is where the Germanic tribes were all congregated. And the other was to the deserts of Arabia. So the Germanic tribes that swept into Spain were all Arians, even though it was 100 years after Arianism had basically died out in the eastern part of the empire. And in the east, the heretical bishops from both the Arian as well as the later heresies of Nestorianism and Monophysitism had gotten pushed out into the deserts of Arabia, where one of them became the father-in-law of a guy named Muhammad, who caused all sorts of problems, to say the least, for the church. Yeah.
Constantine, is that the one that had his soldiers put the sign of the cross, even
Right.
though he was not a Christian yet?
Right.
He had his soldiers put the sign of the cross and what sent them into battle. And,
Right. In this sign, conquer.
Yes.
Yeah. And so Constantine was a great, great man and a great emperor. He had plenty of battles, and he conquered a lot of Germans with the sign of the cross, and I'm sure saw many of them converted as well. But he himself didn't convert until his deathbed, because he didn't think you could be a Roman emperor and make the kind of decisions that were necessary as Roman emperor. In other words, You had to kill people and be a Christian. And so at this time, he was also following a common kind of custom for people to put off their baptism until their deathbed, because that way they could go to their grave knowing that they could keep their confession relatively pure. Confession as we have it had not developed at that point. There was still confession, but it wasn't developed in the way that it did later. Now there was also so Theodosius, the establishment of the church, and what happened with that was that anyone who wanted to be a civil servant of the Roman Empire had to be a Christian, and you had to prove it. You had to give a paper saying that you'd been baptized and that you went to communion. And so what happened? Thousands of people flocked to the churches. With Constantine, it just became acceptable to be a Christian. With Theodosius, it became necessary to be a Christian if you were going to be a civil servant. And with that, this whole secularization began of the church. Now, one thing that you'll find in a lot of in some Protestant textbooks that are evangelical, and then in such nonsense like the Da Vinci Code and things like that, is that they blame Constantine for all sorts of things. Well, it's not true. Constantine did call the Council of Nicaea and paid for it, but it was the bishops that made the decisions, and he basically just wanted to make sure there was peace in the church. He didn't influence the decisions and things like that. He wasn't in charge of repressing women and eliminating the female priesthood and all of the other stuff that he's accused of. There's some sects like Seventh-day Adventists and things that basically, think Constantine had horns and a tail. That that the church died with Constantine and was only resurrected when their particular prophet or reformer, who Mary Baker Eddy or whatever, I don't remember who founded the Adventists, in the mid-19th century. So Constantine is given a bad rap for a lot of things that he didn't do. And for us, he's Saint Constantine. Also, his mother, Helena, went to Jerusalem, wanted to find the cross. And so she dug around and had people dig in places following the legends of where these things were. She found the cross, she found the Lord's tomb, and had Jerusalem essentially reconfigured from a pagan city to a Christian center of pilgrimage. So that even early in the 4th century, Jerusalem became this great center of pilgrimage, whereas in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, it had basically been a pagan city. Another kind of interesting anecdote from the reign of Theodosius. He'd gone off on some campaign where there had been thousands of people killed, and he came back to Milan. Well, the Bishop of Milan was at that time was Ambrose. Ambrose had been elected as bishop when he was still a catechumen. Which was, even for that time, rather unusual, to say the least. He'd been a city official and beloved of the people, so they elected him bishop. But he wouldn't let Theodosius enter the temple, enter the church. because until he repented because he had so much blood on his hands. That was probably the last time the church stood up to the emperor, unfortunately, in such a bold way. But what began under Constantine and was developed under Theodosius was a relationship between church and state called symphony. It was supposed to be the symphony of a harmony between the church and the state acting together. That's where you get the double-headed eagle. One body, two heads, the patriarch and the emperor. Now, usually it's the emperor biting off the head of the patriarch. In reality, in church history, and it was a kind of a vision of a unitary Christian society, one church, one people, one religion, one faith, one nation, or one, not a nation, but one empire. Out of many languages, many races, many colors, many backgrounds, welded together into a single Christian nation, of which the emperor was the anointed king, who was thus an image of God reigning amidst his people.
Wadika, I'm sorry for interrupting, but can we say this is possibly what we see in Russia, happening in Russia today?
It certainly is.
King, but the two heads, the double-headed eagle.
I think so.
Right. Well, that system of the symphony really only ended in 1917 with the abdication of Nicholas II. That was the vision of the Russian monarchy.
And so we're seeing it trying to be put back together.
Right.
Very good.
And it's the same thing. It's the vision of a unitary Christian society, where Christianity structures the entire society, and there's this very close relationship between church and state, and where the entire structure of life comes out of the church's calendar. You know, the feasts and the fasts and the and the celebrations, and it's all about the Orthodox Church.
Was the church divided on whether this was good or not?
No.
The people probably were divided.
Well, what happened, and this kind of moves it to the next, is that with this, they weren't reacting to the church developing the relationship with the state. I think most people were happy that there were no more persecutions. But what people did react to was the secularization of the church. Remember how in the first centuries, the churches were small primary communities. In other words, everybody knew each other. There was only one liturgy on Sunday in any given city that all the Christians would come to, and so it wasn't a huge thing. There weren't a lot of people. It was and there was this constant tension of a fear of martyrdom in the earliest, in the church under the Roman Empire. When Christianity became legalized, more and more people began coming into the church. Curious, when Christianity became the official religion of the empire, everybody who had a job with the state, means all the soldiers, all the bureaucrats, all the state officials, everybody who was working for the government had to be a Christian. So they essentially, so they started cramming into the churches. Well, the churches were totally overwhelmed, whereas before it took 3 years as a catechumen to become a Christian, it was this very in-depth personal commitment, and there was this very, very intense interpersonal relationship in small communities. all of a sudden you've got cathedrals with thousands of people, and who couldn't be catechized according to the old way, who couldn't be dealt with according to the old way, because there were just too many people. And so the church evolved. It evolved parishes. Instead of one cathedral and one Eucharist in a city on a Sunday, there would be multiple Eucharists on Sunday morning in various locations, with the presbyters or the priests being sent by the bishop to serve those liturgies. There was a practice early on, which we still have a remnant of in our liturgy, where the bishop would send a little piece of bread with each of these priests going out to serve the various liturgies, and then the bread from the bishop's Eucharist would be put into the chalice, mixed with the bread that was consecrated, and put into the chalice at the time of the by the priest, so that there was this unity expressed between the bishop's Eucharist and that of the presbyters, because the presbyters the priests were always understood as being representatives of the bishop. They were acting on behalf of the bishop, because the bishop was the high priest, the bishop was the main celebrant of the Eucharist, and the bishop was the archpastor for that region, for that diocese. The way it evolved is the priests took over most of those functions in their parishes. What did that do is they were able to create communities that were small and primary and close, but they didn't have the kind of fervor. And for the first time in the history of the church, there developed people who would later be called nominals. People who would be nominal in their confession of the faith. Show up once a year to say that they've gone to church. Our equivalent of Christmas and Easter people. The hatch-match dispatch crowd. Where they go to church when they're baptized, they go to church when they're married, and they go to church when they're buried, and that's it.
Do you think it's because they were compelled to do it just to get a job?
Yep. And there were certainly, true believers at the time.
But they allowed it. Theodosius allowed it, right?
Well, they had no choice.
Pushed it.
How do you deal with a population where the vision of the state, the emperor's vision is that it creates a unitary Christian society,
right?
And people all believe. Some believe it, and some don't, and some are in between, and some are really committed, and others are not so committed, and because there's always great variation.
Right.
Now, one of the things that's really important to understand, which is totally alien to our culture, is that there was no concept of religious pluralism. There weren't many denominations. It wasn't like the state was Orthodox, but you could go to the Catholic Church, you could go to the Lutherans or the Episcopalians or something like that. Jews were tolerated, people of other religions were tolerated and given, and had rights, and but they were there were some pretty severe limitations put on them. One of the things that's absolutely critical is you can't project your religious and political values on another culture. We have our values as 21st century Americans, but you can't project them or evaluate a culture because the Byzantines had this unitary vision of the church and state, whereas we believe in democracy and religious pluralism. It's just different. it's not, and how can you evaluate it as better or worse? It's just what that culture was at that time. If you want to evaluate it, that's your privilege. I certainly have my own opinions, so anyway, the church began to be secularized. As a result, one of the things that had happened, beginning with in the end of the 3rd century, were that people were going out to the desert to live ascetic lives. And part of the vision of monasticism, as it developed, was to preserve that intensity of Christian life, to preserve that tradition of the early church in its integrity. That whole kind of tension of martyrdom, the detachment necessary for martyrdom, all of the various kinds of things got translated over into asceticism. So instead of not knowing, for many of the early Christians, just like during the Soviet period, so you wouldn't know if you were going to sleep in your own bed again that next night, that you could be taken away at any time, and either tortured or murdered or exiled or something. Of course, they couldn't preserve that kind of tension, and I think most people were glad that it was over. However, the intensity of spiritual life that nurtured was preserved through the practice of asceticism, of leaving your family, leaving your home, leaving your possessions, going out to the desert, and living either as a solitary or in community. The great pioneer of that was pioneers of both types were in the Egyptian desert. There were 3 major centers where monasticism kind of flourished, began in its. One was Egypt, another was Palestine, and the third was in Syria, and northern and eastern Syria. So the great founders in Egypt were Anthony and Pachomius. Anthony of the Eremitic life, Pachomius of the Cenobitic life or the Cenobitic life, where Pachomius had several towns that were monastic. There would be men on one side of a river and women on another, maybe 10,000 in each. They were huge, and people lived in small in houses together under obedience to a senior or an elder, and would come together for the services and things like that. But most of their life was lived doing their whatever work they were doing in these individual houses, and the monasteries were these villages of these monastic houses. Some of the great fathers, Basil the Great and Gregory the Theologian in particular, left Athens after their studies, like on break from college. Actually, it was law school for them. And they went to Egypt, and they toured around, going to visit the hermits in the desert, and as well as some of these great communities. And Basil came back and wrote the first rule for monasticism. Actually, Pachomius had written something, but it was not as developed as Basil's. And Basil developed many different communities within his own sphere of influence. He and his buddy Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory the Theologian themselves established a monastery on the river Iris, not too far outside of the city. In Palestine, and also up into Syria, there was much more of a concentration on solitary life than on community life, and so a lot of the monks became solitaries. In the region of Antioch, you had St. John Chrysostom, for example, who lived part of his life as a solitary, living in a cave when he was still a young man, where he managed to destroy his health. And he was, the people from the cathedral went up there, literally carried him back down, nursed him back to health, and forced him to be ordained, where he became the greatest preacher Antioch ever saw, until they elected him Patriarch of Constantinople, where he lasted a few years until he was exiled, having gravely insulted the Empress, who had erected a silver statue of herself on a pillar outside the cathedral.
What's his name again?
John Chrysostom.
It was also at this time that there was the development of theological centers, which coincided with the development of some of these ascetic centers. In Alexandria, you had what had grown from the catechetical school founded by Clement of Alexandria, of which Origen had been a student and then later a director, and it developed this whole theological perspective based on an allegorical interpretation of Scripture. Antioch had a far more Semitic orientation, and it produced one of the greatest theological or scriptural, or a couple of the greatest scriptural interpreters. Theodore of Mopsuestia, who was the teacher of St. John Chrysostom and of Nestorius, and who was later condemned, or some of his writings were later condemned because of his role in teaching heretics. But the Antiochian school became one of the most prominent theological influences, and there was a kind of battle between these two schools for for influence within the Church in the Roman Empire. There was another center. If you go, it's out toward contemporary Baghdad, called Edessa in northern Syria. And it was also a very, very ancient center of Christianity. You've heard of Veronica's Veil, where there's a story that a woman came and wiped Christ's face with her veil as he was carrying the cross going to Golgotha. Well, his face appeared on that cloth, then there's another story of Abgar of Edessa. Abgar was the king of this city, and he wanted to know what Jesus looked like. And so he wrote to Jesus, and Jesus took a piece of cloth and wiped his face with it and sent it to Abgar. So there's various stories about this, then also conflated with the Shroud of Turin story.
Is that the icon behind you?
Yeah, the icon made without hands.
That's it.
Yeah, it wasn't painted. It was, Jesus wiped his face with. Whether it's the Shroud of Turin, whether it's Veronica's Veil, or whether it's the napkin given to King Abgar, it became the kind of defining relic of the Church of Edessa. Edessa was on the border between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, which were the two great rivals at the time. there were many Christians in eastern Syria, and some of them inside the Roman Empire, some of them outside the Roman Empire. Well, if you were outside the Roman Empire, it was not exactly politically correct to be under the Church of the Roman Empire and to pray for the Roman Empire against your own emperor, the Persian emperor. And so there were all sorts of conflicts. But what evolved was a whole unique school of Christianity centered on Edessa and eastern Syria, into what is now Iraq, even into Iran, that spoke Syriac, which was the language of that region. All the theological discussion of the ecumenical councils was going on in Greek. And even though Antioch was the center of the Syriac-speaking Roman Empire, Greek was what was used as a kind of a language for the cultured class and for trade. But the people themselves spoke Syriac. In Alexandria, here again, the language of trade, the language of culture, the language of theology was Greek, but the people spoke Coptic. In Rome, the language up until the 4th century was all in Greek. Latin didn't develop. Latin developed as a theological language in Carthage in North Africa, in the large settlements, Roman settlements there, and they developed their own unique theological kind of vision, which you can pick up in the writings of St. Augustine, who wrote around the year. He died around the year 451, I believe, give or take. He died as the Germanic tribes were sacking his city, so you had these major theological centers, two of which coincided with major political and economic centers, Alexandria and Antioch. The first two ecumenical councils dealt with Arianism, Nicaea and Constantinople, but the third council was in Ephesus, which is on the coast of Asia Minor. The fourth council was Chalcedon, which is a suburb of Constantinople. Both of those councils produced significant minorities which were cut off from the church. The third council, the Council of Ephesus in 431, was convened to condemn Nestorius, who was a fellow student of John Chrysostom under the tutelage of Theodore of Mopsuestia. And they had this very Eastern or Semitic kind of a take on theology, but the kind of slogan that was used is that Nestorius refused to call Mary Theotokos. He said she was Christotokos, the one who bore the Christ, but not the one who bore God. Because his understanding of the incarnation was obviously very weak. He had this idea that the Christ indwelt the man Jesus, so that there was this kind of radical duality in Jesus. There was the human man, and then the divine Spirit or the divine Son indwelling in Jesus.
That's not monos.
No, that's Nestorianism.
Oh.
So
that's not talking about the. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. However, this also was, whether they were as radical as Nestorius or not, the church in the east, the Church of Edessa, and of the eastern part of the Roman Empire going into Syria, sympathized with Nestorius. They agreed with him theologically, because they also had this very Semitic emphasis on the concrete humanity of Christ. And so they went off into schism. Now, the church of the history of the Church of the East is absolutely fascinating, and it's one of the most it was one of the most intensely missionary churches that has ever existed. Within 300 years of that, they were on the Pacific coast, all the way to China, which is pretty amazing. And with millions and millions and millions of Christians all across South Asia, in places, and there were metropolitan sees, for a metropolitan cathedral, and you're talking about a lot of Christians, right? In Kabul, in Afghanistan, in northern India, in Tibet, in China, and there were also the church got into Japan. I'm not sure about Korea, and it also went into Southeast Asia by the year 700, with vast, vast numbers of people. And in China, it was called the Luminous Religion. So this is the fruit of the Church of the East, but it was basically of Edessa, of Syria, the Syriac-speaking church, Edessa and eastward.
Okay.
So going all the way from Syria in a solid line through, through Afghanistan, through Pakistan, through northern India, through Tibet, through China.
And they were influenced by the guy who would not say Theotokos, or is this...
Right.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that they're still called Nestorian, even though that's really, they're not. But is this making sense? Okay. I know it's a little disjointed.
No, it flows very well.
Okay. The Fourth Council was called to combat a heresy that was come up with by an old archimandrite, an old man in Alexandria. The heresy was called Monophysitism, and his idea was that the humanity of Jesus got swallowed up by his divinity, so that in the resurrection all there was the divine Christ, and the human was basically virtually obliterated. Of course, there's problems there with the resurrection, to say the least, but also the whole Christian vision from the beginning is that the human body is sanctified. Now, the great champion of that council and this great kind of theologian was Cyril of Alexandria. He also was the champion against Nestorius in the previous council. The slogan, as it were, coming out of the Third Council is Theotokos. That Mary is truly the Mother of God, not just the Mother of Jesus, but the Mother of God. In the Fourth Council, they had no problem with calling Mary the Mother of God. But what they did, what the Monophysites had a problem with, is they asserted that the language that was being used to describe the union of the divine and the human in Christ made Jesus kind of schizophrenic, a kind of odd duality of two natures, essentially meaning two different persons in Jesus. So that there was being set up a conflict between Christ's humanity and Christ's divinity, and so the Orthodox solution to that was that there are two natures, the divine and the human, united in the one divine person of the Logos. So that in Jesus there is no human person. In other words, there's not a separate existence of the man Jesus, except as the incarnate Son of God.
So it's just God made into flesh.
Yeah, but with a full human body and soul, and like us in, as the decree says, like us in every way except for sin. In other words, with a human body and soul, united without division, confusion, separation, or, well, you got the idea. So that it's the unity of the divine and the human in Jesus is eternal and permanent, and that in Christ humanity is raised up to the throne of the Father, which is the ancient scriptural faith. Really, when it comes down to it, all the theological issues have to do with a misinterpretation or a misreading of Scripture, and so it's a matter of what the councils did is they explicated the scriptural mind and the mind of the church in order to have the doctrine be uniform.
From the Theotokos,
Uh-huh.
how is the term mother theologically defined? Because it is, like the mother of the Creator.